much, and hello everyone. Greetings and solidarity from the Socialist Workers' Party in Britain. We're holding this meeting at a very terrible moment in European and world history because we're confronted with the most appalling and destructive war. I mean, the latest news is this evidence of Russian atrocities in the suburbs of Kiev, which are just one indication of the barbarity of this war. Now, the title of this meeting is "How does the left rise to the challenge of the war?" Now, it's easy enough to be against this war. It's easy enough to oppose the invasion and demand the withdrawal of Russian troops, and the international tendency of which both the SWN in Ireland and the SWP in Britain are part, the international socialist tendency has taken a clear position against the invasion. But it's not possible to stop there, as if you look at the left internationally, many tendencies have tended to do. It's always easy to condemn the crimes of other ruling classes, of foreign ruling classes. There's no cost in Britain or Ireland or the rest of Europe or the United States to condemn Vladimir Putin today. But we have always to see what role our own ruling class is playing in the present situation. And this is why the Marxist theory of imperialism is so useful. It was developed as a tool, really a political tool by Marxists, revolutionary socialists confronting the First World War, when the bulk of the international working class movement rallied, or the leaders at least, rallied to support their own ruling classes. James Connolly, of course, was one of the outstanding exceptions to this. And it served as a means for identifying the way in which the class struggle, the struggle between workers and bosses, shapes wars, even the greatest national wars between rival powers. And how does it do that? I would say, I'm not going to spend so long on the theory, but just to say briefly, the theory of imperialism says three things that are relevant to us. First of all, it sees imperialism, modern imperialism, as an outgrowth of capitalism. Lenin famously called it the highest stage of capitalism. In other words, imperialism is what develops as capitalism matures as a system and comes to dominate globally. Secondly, imperialism is characterized by what I call the coming together, the fusion of economic and geopolitical competition. Economic competition is the kind of rivalry between firms, the markets and so on, that drives capitalism as a system, leads firms to continue squeezing their workers and to accumulate, to reinvest in expansion and more advanced technologies and so on. Geopolitical competition is the rivalries between states for territory and so on. The Ukraine war is in a certain sense a classic case of geopolitical competition. This has been going on for thousands of years, ever since class societies emerged. But what we see with modern capitalist imperialism is the way in which this geopolitical competition is integrated and subordinated to the competitive accumulation of capital. Firms need states to support them in their rivalries, and states need their own capitalist industrial base to compete with each other. The final point I want to make briefly about the theory of imperialism is that imperialism is a system. You see, there's a more traditional understanding of imperialism where imperialism is just a big power bullying its neighbors. And you can trace that back to the Roman Empire or the Persian Empire, lots of ancient empires. Again, this is something that has been going on in some form as long as class society has existed. But modern imperialism isn't simply about one big bully. It's a system of bullies. It's a system of rival capitalist powers, the biggest and strongest, both economically and militarily, in the world, dominating the rest of the world, dominating not simply the workers and peasants, the people who produce the profits, but also dominating other capitalist classes. And these different capitalist powers competing with each other for domination. I mean, you can see this historically with the First and Second World War, then with the rivalries between the Soviet Union and the US during the Cold War. And today we see the US struggling to maintain its position as the globally hegemonic power. Now, it became fashionable to say that the Marxist theory of imperialism was obsolete. It was out of date. The beginning of this century, two well-known Marxists, Michael Hart and Tony Negri, published a book called Empire, where they said that economic globalization meant that the kind of rivalries that we saw with classical imperialism between big powers were obsolete. They were finished. Well, the problem with that is what we're confronted today is with a war of globalization. It's common to present Putin as a kind of psychopath and Russia as a kind of archaic regime. The problem with saying that is that Russia's power, its military power, crucially depends on its role in the global economy as an exporter of oil and gas, one of the biggest in the world. And the oligarchs, people like Abramovich, who are being hunted down now by Western capitalism, when you see all the things that are being taken from them, their yachts and Abramovich has an absurd number of yachts, incredible. Their mansions, in his case, their football teams, and so on. All of these reflect the extent to which the Russian oligarchs have built up their wealth through Russia's participation in global capitalism. They are part of the global super rich. So this is a war not between some archaic ancient power and modern capitalism. This is a war inside modern global capitalism. From the perspective of the Ukrainians, it's a war of national defense. In other words, the Ukrainians are fighting to defend their country from the invasion that have taken place, and they have the right to defend themselves. But it's very important to understand this isn't the end of the story. This is an inter-imperialist war. It's a struggle between, on the one hand, the most powerful bloc of imperialist states in the world, NATO, led by the United States, fighting a much weaker imperialism. I mean, the Russian economy is the size of Italy, quite a big economy, but not as big, let's say, as the US or China. And more than that, it's a war by proxy. In other words, the US and its allies aren't directly fighting in the war, but they're building up and supporting Ukraine to fight and defeat Russia. And we have to talk about NATO. When socialists mention NATO, they get dismissed and accused of whataboutery or apologizing for Putin. This is nonsense. Putin is a monster, and the sooner the Russian working class overthrow him, the better. But this is, as I said, imperialism is a system, and it's this system of rivalry that has produced the war. And here we have to talk about NATO. Now, NATO was a military alliance that the US, with particularly the support of Britain, created at the start of the Cold War, at the end of the 1940s. So there's a question that one has to ask. Why does NATO still exist? The Cold War ended in 1989, when the Berlin Wall broke open. Why does NATO still exist? And the answer is very interesting. There's a new book that I'm reading at the minute called Not 1 Inch, which is about how NATO didn't dissolve, but expanded at the end of the Cold War. And I'm learning a lot from it. So Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, said, after the Berlin Wall broke open, he said, okay, fair enough, the Germans want to reunite, but let them reunite outside NATO as a neutral country, and let's withdraw, the US should withdraw the nuclear weapons it keeps in West Germany. The US had 8,000 nuclear weapons in West Germany during the Cold War, which is an incredible amount. And the Americans were really worried about this because they knew that people in West Germany hated the nuclear weapons on their soil because they knew they would be the first victims of a war between NATO and the Soviet Union. But the US president at the time, George H.W. Bush, the father of the guy who started the Iraq War, said, to hell with that. To hell with United Germany withdrawing from NATO. And the reason for that was explained in a paper that an American diplomat wrote. And this is the summary. To Washington, this outcome, a united Germany outside NATO, was completely unacceptable because it would forfeit the prime asset, the troops and weapons that have made the United States a post-war European power. That have made the United States a post-war European power. So that shows what NATO was and is about. It's about allowing the US to dominate Europe. That's what it's about. And this is why, after the Cold War, not simply did the United Germany join NATO, but after the Cold War, NATO expanded eastwards into the states that had been part of the Soviet Empire in Central and Eastern Europe. And this was explained by the architect of the policy, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was National Security Advisor to a US president. He said, Europe is America's essential bridgehead in the Eurasian continent. In other words, the European Union in particular is the ally that allows the US to dominate at least the western part of Eurasia. What's interesting also is that Brzezinski called Ukraine a geopolitical pivot, because without Ukraine, he says, Russia ceases to be a Eurasian power. So in other words, not simply must expand NATO eastwards, but it's really important that Ukraine has become independent because it weakens Russia so severely. This helps to explain why in 2014, when Ukraine, which had vacillated between East and West after it became independent in 1991, when in 2014, Ukraine tilted decisively towards the West, the US and NATO poured in resources, poured in arms, poured in trainers and advisors to support Ukraine militarily. And we're seeing the effects of that now in the war. What Putin is doing is responding to the same, if you like, objective reality that Russia is hugely weakened by Ukraine shifting into the Western camp, particularly if it's were to join NATO, to try and grab it back, and using a fairly obscene and disgusting nationalist mythology to justify seizing Ukraine. So it's the struggle for Ukraine isn't about Ukrainian self-determination. It's a struggle between rival imperialist powers. And the NATO strategy is to keep out of the war, keep out of the direct fighting, because if NATO warplanes and so on got involved, say, in creating a no-fly zone, that would probably lead to war between Russia and NATO, which could easily develop into a thermonuclear war that would kill off humankind even more quickly than climate change would. But they stay out of the direct fighting.
5 minutes.
But yeah, they pour more armaments into Ukraine to support the Ukrainian government militarily, and they seek to crush Russia economically, in particular by denying it access to the financial system. And it's interesting to see the US and the EU working in tandem with this, with the European Central Bank playing a central role in the whole process. Remember how the European Central Bank enforced the power of the Troika during the years of austerity on countries like Ireland and Greece. Remember when the European Central Bank shut down the Greek financial system, the Greek banks, in 2015. This is the same kind of power that is now being turned on a much larger scale against Russia. This is essentially a strategy of waging the war without directly being engaged in the fighting. And it's creating a very dangerous cycle of escalation, as we saw when Putin ordered the activation of Russia's nuclear forces after the first bout of financial sanctions. And the fact that Russia is losing the war against Ukraine, which seems to be what all the military experts are saying, isn't necessarily such a positive development, because it will increase the temptation on the part of Putin and his allies to resort at least to a very limited use of nuclear weapons, at least as a demonstration, which in turn, well, who knows where that would lead. I don't believe the peace talks are going to go anywhere, the negotiations in Istanbul. Even if they did go somewhere, even if there was some kind of deal that ended the fighting, it would be temporary, because both sides would want to pursue their objectives. Putin's of dominating Ukraine, and the Ukrainians of winning back all that they've lost in the war. Meanwhile, it's clear from what Western governments are doing that they expect working people to pay for this war and the broader crisis. Look at the way in which inflation is being allowed to eat into people's living standards. The figures have just come out saying that there's been the biggest cut in Eurozone workers' real wages since records started. That's an indication of the way in which, even if the war doesn't get worse, people are being squeezed to pay for it. So we have to say, stop the war, Russian troops out, but that's not enough. We have to say, don't escalate. People Before Profit has really good posters about this. We have to say no to arms shipments and sanctions, because they are crucial to escalating they're the crucial Western means of escalation, and build the anti-war movement. And of course, the most important section of the global anti-war movement is that in Russia. We have to see how it develops there and support it in any way we can. This means rebuilding the anti-war movement, which declined after the US occupation of Iraq was defeated, and it has to be rebuilt on a different basis, because campaigning to stop the war today means campaigning against NATO and Western imperialism, not only against Russian imperialism and the occupiers. But we also have to remember what the great leaders of the revolutionary left confronted with the First World War in 1914, where they stood. People like Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, they said, the problem is the system. The problem is the imperialist system, not one of the particular antagonistic imperialist powers. It's not enough in particular to denounce the imperialism of the other side. As Luxemburg's comrade Karl Liebknecht said, the main enemy is at home. So we have to build the anti-war movement, but we have to build a socialist movement that's strong enough to get rid of the entire system of capitalist imperialism. And therefore, if there are people taking part in this meeting who aren't members of the Socialist Workers Network, or indeed People Before Profit, please join them, because we need to build a stronger socialist movement to take on this terrible system. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much. And some really important issues and points raised there that I hope we can come back to in the discussion. And just to say for myself, just before I let Kieran in, I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. I'm a steering committee member of the Irish Anti-War Movement, and we have had a number of actions in the last few weeks. And one of our main slogans has been, as well as condemning Russia's invasion, one of our other main slogans has been not militarization, not NATO. And there's a lot to be discussed as well in terms of Ireland's position as a neutral country, which I hope will come up in the discussion as well. So our next speaker then is Kieran Allen, also for 20 minutes. And then after that, we'll have time for discussion and questions. So you can go ahead, Kieran.
Yeah, sorry, thanks, Sarah, and thanks to Alex for that. And I'll try not to repeat his general argument on the Marxist theory on imperialism. So look, the first point I want to make is that it's often tempting when you see the horrors of this war to think at some stage we will be going back to the normal patterns of Western democracy once this episode is over. And I think that would be a fundamental misconception. I think that this war is a rupture in the style of rule of the Western ruling class. And you only have to look, for example, at Larry Fink, who is the CEO of BlackRock, who has said that essentially the war represents the end of 3 decades of globalization. And what he's referring to there is how the world economy is being weaponized in terms of seizing Russian assets. So the whole nostrum of globalization is of the challenge. And similarly, there's a very interesting speech by Joe Biden at the Business Roundtable in Washington, where he talks, let me just actually quote him. He says, the Second World War led to 60 million deaths, but eventually it produced liberal democracy. He says, now is a time when things are shifting. There's going to be a new world order out there, and we've got to lead it, and we've got to unite the rest of the free world in doing it. So when you hear that, and then you put in context the daily coverage of war in the Ukraine and the horrors of war and the bringing, if you like, the people's living rooms of the horrors of war, and then you contrast that with the sheer ignorance of the population about the 4 million people who've died in the Congo, or the more than 250,000 who have died in Yemen, you ask, well, what actually is going on here? Why, when you travel anywhere in Western Europe at the moment, or look at your local GA club, you'll find solidarity with Ukraine. And the reason is, I just want to argue this quite strongly, is we are moving into a new era where our rulers of Western Europe, what's called the Western Alliance, are trying to acclimatize the Western public to the idea of a new world order, to the idea of militarism, of war, that, if you like, the era just of liberal democracy is coming to a close. We're moving to an era of liberal democracy plus preparation for war. And that in many ways is the effect of this propaganda. Now, like Alex, I want to argue that there are not just one dimension to this war, but there are 3 main dimensions to this conflict. There's, first of all, as he said, a war of national defense against an oppressive invasion. But secondly, there is an inter-imperialist proxy war. And the point I'll probably stress a little bit more is that this inter-imperialist proxy war is in many ways leading to the formation of a new strengthened Western alliance, but on the back of a decaying capitalism, and a decaying capitalism that I think in the longer term will present the left with certain opportunities for both resisting war, but also resisting the system that breeds it. Okay, so let's start with the first dimension. So sometimes you get on the left, if you like, the sort of notion that the groupings like People for Profit has not been sufficiently condemnatory of Vladimir Putin. So in case there's any misconception of this, I mean, we think that Putin is a war criminal. He's a thug. What he's done to Mariupol in terms of subjecting a civilian population to utmost brutality is something that, quite rightly, horrifies the vast majority of the population. And what's behind Putin, if we ask what's behind the brutality, we have to say that what's behind it is the ideology of great Russian chauvinism. This is the idea that Ukraine does not exist, or it's simply the little brother of the sort of mother Russia. It's a tradition that goes deep into Russian history, where, for example, the Ukrainian language was banned from the early 1800s. And it's a tradition very much that links both Stalin in the 40s and 50s to, if you like, czars like Catherine the Great, in assuming that Russia had a right to essentially assert its domination over its neighbors. And this explains, it's very important to say this explains Putin's slightly bizarre attack on Lenin, claiming that Lenin caused all this by allowing the autonomy of Ukraine after the Russian Revolution. So I think that's pretty clear what Putin is doing. But just to essentially back up Alex in the argument, this is not just, if you like, an individual who has suddenly read Russian history and become a convinced great Russian chauvinist. What we find happening in Russia is that Putin came to power in 2000 after a decade in which Russia experienced probably the worst economic depression since the Wall Street crash, when living standards decreased to such an extent that life expectancy dropped. And therefore he came in, if you like, to some extent seen as the savior, the economic savior, because there was considerable growth in Russia from 2000 up to the global crash of 2008. Since then, however, the Russian economy has stagnated. If you compare, for example, the Russian economy to the Chinese economy, Russia has become essentially a producer of primary goods, oil and gas. It shows little industrial diversification beyond armaments. And therefore, Russia, in many ways, is trying to use its military muscle in order to compensate for its economic weakness, to gain certain economic advantages in the way that Alex argued in terms of the general Marxist theory of imperialism. Now, I think in reality, it's been unsuccessful. I think Putin is losing this war. I think the only question is, will the Western powers be able to carry it right through to the extent of seeing him dragged before an international criminal court, which is their aim, or will hopefully, from our point of view, there emerge in Russia a stronger movement of opposition to Putin, which we would very much welcome. Now, having said that, I made absolutely clear what is happening here. This is a war of national defense against an oppressor, which obviously people in Ireland are very sympathetic to. It would be wrong not to see the wood for the trees. And sometimes you get kind of on sort of spurious arguments on the left, the idea that, well, what's wrong with the people of Ukraine getting arms from an imperialist power? Didn't Roger Casement, in the run-up to 1916, try to get some support for the Irish cause of freedom by taking guns from the Germans? Well, I think that's really to misunderstand the scale of what's actually happening. And just to put it in perspective, we're talking about the NATO sending to Ukraine in 6 days 17,000 anti-tank missiles. They claim themselves this is a bigger operation than the attempt to break the blockade over Berlin back in the 40s. They have stationed 40,000 troops in this area from the Baltic to the Black Sea. And as one source in Washington told the New York Times, he says, how did we get sucked in to this moment? So therefore, in terms of the scale of what's happening, it is much more accurate to characterize this war as a proxy war rather than simply a national defense force taking a small number of weapons from wherever they can get them. But in this, it's important to say, there is a strange parallel between Russia attempting to use its military might to gain overlordship over what he would consider its sphere of influence, and what America is doing at the moment. Because we should remember that this war follows from the traumatic defeat of America in Vietnam. This is, and if you think about it from the point of view of the American ruling class, being defeated in Vietnam is bad enough. Being defeated then in Afghanistan in a time when it looked like China was about to overtake America as having being the biggest the biggest economy in the global economy, where there's been a long-term decline of the American economy, shrinking, for example, from 1/2 of the world's GDP after the Second World War to approximately 1/4 today, where even the use of the American dollar as reserve currency is beginning to slip. In this situation, we find America, through the agency of NATO, is also determined to use military leverage to buttress its economy and to win back, and this is a term that they use constantly, the leadership over Europe. And when we talk about leadership, what in reality this is more like, it is more like a gang boss essentially offering a protection racket and taking the proceeds and the protection money for that racket. That is the position that America wants to get itself into. Now, this to some extent explains what, for those of us who are a bit older, what is tremendously odd about this whole conflict. It's almost like you've gone back to the 1950s, where you're reading Time magazine. We're back in the middle of the Cold War, except now the war is being fought not against communism, but the idea of an authoritarian Russian state. And what we find, like we found in the 50s, is that the sort of liberal ethos in the West is now being combined, not just with increased talk about diversity and inclusion and diversity and so on, but it's now being spoken of in terms of the need of a strong arm and a military muscle to defend Western values. This was precisely the discourse of the 1950s. Now, in this situation, therefore, it seems to me that the tasks of socialists are pretty clear. Yes, of course, we stand in solidarity with the Ukrainian people. This is why, for example, People for Profit called protest at the Russian embassy and particularly highlighted the role of the anti-war movement, why we've taken part in the Irish Congress of Trade Unions protest at the Ukrainian embassy, all the time indicating our opposition to NATO as well. But in addition to that, we have to be the people that challenge the new ideology of a binary world, of the free world versus authoritarianism, and the free world having its spearhead being NATO. And I mean, just to understand how we can challenge that is very important. I mean, people talk about, you know, there's this conflict between NATO representing the free world and the terrible authoritarian in Russia, and for that matter in China. But we should remember, for example, that when NATO was established, one of its founding members was Portugal, which at that time was run by the Salazar dictatorship, that the colonel regime that when the colonels staged their coup in Greece, they were never thrown out of NATO. NATO has never simply been about defending freedom versus authoritarianism. When we look at the main countries, or some of the main countries in NATO today, we're talking about Hungary and Poland. These are countries that have been denounced at one stage by the EU itself for their authoritarian tendencies. And similarly, if we challenge the binary of the free world versus authoritarianism, we also have to challenge this insidious idea that somehow those in Russia, or for that matter, those in China, are so devoid of the capacity to organize and indeed think that they're in this totalitarian regime, that the only hope is military defense against them, as against looking to the power of workers and indeed the anti-war movement in countries like Russia. And the last point I want to make is this. You see, I think the arguments the left is making is very, very important, but there can also be a tendency on the left to think that in these very, very bleak conditions, we are almost returning to what I would call the Zimmerwald syndrome. In other words, that the Zimmerwald was a conference in 1915 when about 38 different socialists, albeit delegates, came together and they split into various groupings. The notion that is that we are a tiny minority, divorced from the population, that the only issue is really to hold on, to make our propaganda, and then at some stage to hope that as the enthusiasm for war declines, people will flock to the socialist banner. I don't think that's the situation we're in, quite frankly. I think we have to learn how to frame our arguments in ways that reaches a considerable number of people in the present situation in order to be in a better position to challenge the contradictions that will inevitably arise within this system at the moment. And how do we do that? I think that we do this by understanding that our ruling class faces certain problems in the gambit they're now undertaking to move what they would call a new world order. They face a problem at the level of discourse and ideology. They talk about the evils of invasion, the brutality of war, but yet the double standards are absolutely clear to many, many people. To, for example, the Israeli occupation of Palestine, to the German supplying of armaments to Saudi Arabia. My neighbor, for example, a relatively apolitical woman, tells me she's raised 4,000 euros to help the Ukrainians. And when you point out to her, that's absolutely brilliant, you've done that. But have you not considered that, for example, the people of Yemen deserve some support, the people of Palestine deserve some support? Of course, she agrees very, very quickly. So it is not as if the ideology of the ruling class is without problems. They have problems in carrying through their arguments. And similarly, they have problems if you think about the shift from the discourse about the environment, which happened just last November, when we were told at the time that there is now going to be a really serious attempt to deal with climate change, to invest in renewables. What do we find at the moment? We find that the share price of BP is shot up, that investment in coal is increasing. The prospect, as we know in this country, of, for example, Eamon Ryan, there's another element of the economic competition now welcoming in liquefied natural gas in order to replace any reliance on the Russians. All of this shows the weakness of their ideology in the longer term. And similarly, to return to the point Alex made at the end, we are facing a situation where working people are being asked to bear the cost of this war. And what that in reality means, if you think about it, that Russian wheat represents about a quarter of all globally traded wheat. Irish farmers, for example, have suggested that 38% of their compound fertilizers come from Russia. You can see that this move to break from the old era of globalization into two different worlds of different imperial blocks, this is going to mean a tremendous pressure on working class living standards. And as it puts pressure on working class living standards, we're already seeing in the north of Ireland, workers are beginning to respond. We just have a mini strike wave in the north, as if you like, council workers, bus workers, lecturers, and so on, begin to take action against falling living standards. So I think that in many ways there is scope for socialists to carry through the argument against this war, and indeed a NATO, but also to connect with wider numbers of people. And very lastly, in Ireland, there is a very specific task to be undertaken here, which is, it's perfectly clear now, that the ruling class want to be rid of the last vestiges of Irish neutrality. This is why constantly they tell us to have a mature conversation. They present these fantasies about Russia possibly willing to attack Ireland. But yet there is a substantive feeling in the country to defend neutrality, even after all this propaganda, and to resist any pressure coming on the Irish ruling class to sign up and to show that they are part of the international solidarity of the ruling class by joining NATO. And we have to point out that joining NATO, or if you like, implementing the PESCO agreement, the agreement to raise military spending to 2% of GDP, this will have horrific consequences in terms of housing and in terms of health services in this country at the moment. So to finish, I think that what socialists have to do is be very, very clear in opposing Putin's war, in opposing the invasion of Ukraine, but all the time accompany that with a critique of NATO, opposing their sanctions, opposing every attempt to step up the armament industry, and also doing so in a way that relates to thousands of working class people and to put ourselves in a position to be able to resist their moves to undermine neutrality and indeed support workers as they begin to move into a fight against inflation.
Thanks.